master's student in film and media studies at Columbia University. He's in his first year. And he's also a freelance writer for the art and criticism journal Akai. As a Turkish immigrant with interests in socio-political, radical media, and film, much of his research examines cultural instability and the avant-garde, analyzing filmic or visual artifact corollaries. His writing in new media theory synthesizes deconstructions of regimes of power, examining ontological shifts in biopower, postmodernity, and communicative capitalism, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of really intense stuff that he's working on right now, and I'm looking forward to your paper, which is called, there it is, Radical Cryptophasia Beyond Biopolitics. Take it away.
Thank you. So, as Deleuze notes in his 1992 article, Postscript on Societies of Control, it would appear that Foucault was aware of a coming shift in the way that biopower operates, and retrospectively, we can see this in the trajectory of Discipline and Punish. In the very beginning of the text, we're introduced to Robert Francois Damien, or Damien the Regicide, at his execution for parricide during the late 1600s. Foucault guides us with great detail through a period characterized by the abrupt abandonment of judicial violence as a public ritualized event and its removal or relocation to invisible sites. At the end of this text, power is described as it is exercised in the 20th century, far more economically and efficiently, moving towards self-disciplining behavior. Consequently, contemporary theorists such as Tony Bennett and Douglas Crimp have used Foucault's self-regulation as a model to examine self-surveillance in their readings of the Crystal Palace, exhibition, and museum spaces, respectively. But arguably, Deleuze's postscript takes us considerably further and offers more for new media. Despite the aforementioned theorists, contributions to visual cultural studies are ineffable. Published in 1990, the same year as the inception of the World Wide Web, Deleuze notes shifts from the analog to the digital, from closed sites to open circuits, and presciently remarks on latent capitalism's direction towards meta-production, towards what a service economy, or what Donna Haraway calls a homework economy, rather than one based on production. But what I want to highlight here is Deleuze's comment that control has to deal with people excluded from this meta-production, and thereby examine such a case in lieu of resistance or reactivity. I hope to offer, through my case study of Virginia and Grace Kennedy in Jean-Pierre Gorin's Poto and Cabengo, that it evinces Deleuze's claim that in control society, resistance, or what we can conceive of as the creative act, posits counter-information and radical possibility. It destabilizes social organization that frames it. So the case study I would like to examine involves a pair of twins who speak their own secret language. This is a phenomenon known as idioglassia or cryptophasia. And it's the subject of Gorin's 1980 documentary, Poto and Cabengo. However, it's not exactly the Kennedy twins that I seek to examine, but their cryptophasia, and not the characteristics of their cryptophasia during its short-lived performance. I say short-lived because, as Gorin's documentary notes, the twins eventually ceded to the dominant spoken language, English, as teenagers. It's not the historical or objective case of the Kennedy twins' cryptophasia that I'm interested in. This would be an impossibility to examine anyway, as such an analysis would be mediated through whichever archive of texts one were to employ. So it's explicitly the filmic study of Grace and Virginia Kennedy in Poto and Cabengo that I wish to turn to. Now, turning to cinema to examine instances of political mobility risks appealing to those arguments posited by Comolli and Narbori, that every film is political or every film is ideological, or the practice of what Althusserian film theory emphasizes, the politics of aesthetics, or what's called knowledge effects. And both these approaches share that there's a belief that films and film theory should thwart ideology, understood as both content, understood as familiar stereotypes from the social imaginary, and form, such as habitual, consensual approaches to mise-en-scène and montage that define the visible and the thinkable. But I'm turning to the methodologies of Deleuze and Badiou. My goal is not to seek a knowledge effect or to draw attention to the apparatus, but illuminate the characteristics of resistance that can uniquely appear through cinematic gestures. So this is my way of navigating Badiou's question in the special May 68 interview with Cahiers, where he asks, what does cinema think that nothing but it can think? So I'm drawing on Deleuze to propose that Poto and Cabengo, and by extension cinema, can offer new forms of thinking by creating images that make no distinction between mental reality and material reality. So this means abandoning film as knowledge. This means that we abandon film as an ideological expression and posit it as a practice of images and signs composed of movement and time that is neither a reflection of the world nor an object to be thought in relationship to consciousness or psychology or the practice of the spectator. So I want to conceive of Poto and Cabengo and this instance of cryptophasia in relation to the database terms of postmodernity. I'm drawing my critique on those instrumentalizing Manovich's characterization that the database is a symbolic dominant form, which Manovich ties to the filmic operation of postmodernity. I hope to imply something extra filmic, that the database is an articulation of the movement of control society in its enumerative categorical insistence, but that radical cryptophasia, which denotes the resistant possibilities to combat control society, illuminates other possibilities. So it's been almost 40 years since Jean-Pierre Gorin, the filmmaker probably most infamous for Tout va bien and radicalizing Godard, co-founding the Marxist Brechtian Ziga Versoff group, filmed this documentary, Poto and Cabengo, at San Diego Hospital from 77 to 79. He filmed it while he was a professor in California. And the film uses an amalgam of the visual essay style and the ethnographic, ethno-fictive study in examining two very animated sisters, Grace and Virginia Kennedy, who speak with one another in this rapid-fire language that nobody else understands. Interestingly, this surplus of physicians, linguists, critical family members who circumscribe them never explicitly terminologize the Kennedy twins as private language, repeatedly preferring to codify the Kennedy twins as, quote, retarded, unquote. For the diagnostic and medical order, terminologizing their fluid private language would grant the twins certain semiological validity and disrupt natural science's closed system, its rules of accumulation, exclusion, and reactivation. So for the extended Kennedy family, terminologizing the cryptophasia as such would imbue the secret language with presence and risk some kind of permanence. The Kennedy family observably holds out hope that English's slow genesis will take the place of the Kennedy twins' cryptophasia, and that's simply delayed. In the end, it would appear that they're correct. However, uniquely, there are no disciplinary measures at play. The Kennedy twins are not forced into English classes. They're not isolated in the clinic and harryingly prodded at. Aside from hope, or perhaps what I think trust in control society and psychopolitics, the circumscriptional authoritative bodies do little. Yet their hope is not misguided, and while they may not seem to be aware of it, the Kennedy family members and physicians and linguists seem to recognize the prevalence of self-disciplining auto-surveillance, or what Byung-Chul Han terms auto-exploitation. In 1976, French psychologist René Zazo coined the private language shared among twins as cryptophasia. He qualified the diagnosis with delay. The twins are delayed in adopting the dominant hegemonic language. And throughout his clinical psychology typology reviews, linguist Peter Backer has consistently contributed to the study of cryptophasia at length. He's made formative qualifications, and in 2003, his observations included that cryptophasia is completely unintelligible to speakers of model socialized languages, lacks the morphology from which word order is derived, and the private language's diction is deprived of the pragmatic principles of saliency and semantic scope. These terms describe the Kennedy twins' cryptophasia accurately. The Kennedy twins' language does not operate according to acoustic progression or logic, and Gorin often capitalizes on this by decoupling acousmatic devices or displacing sounds. However, in a 2013 study, Bakker attributes stability to cryptophasia, that the private language operates through a logic, introducing the possibility of translation if given the cipher's rule or lingua. However, as Gorin shows with the film, this instance of cryptophasia, it's reinventive, it's dynamic, it's fluid, it's boundless, rather than cryptophasia as something that operates according to a cipher. It's motile. It juggles this constant potential of revision. So it's neither actively nor passively informative in this sense, because it doesn't seek to inscribe itself as a dominant order. It's denied this attainability. So this is how I like to conceive of the metaphor of radical cryptophasia. It's constantly moving, it's in flux, it's immutable, it's constantly grossing an infinitude of possibilities. It draws from the possibilities of the relationship between movement and the symbolic other equal, that which frames the imaginary, a disregard towards the constitution of ideology world being, which is performed via distantiation. So this parallels the movement of Deleuze's creative act, as radical cryptophasia's simultaneous repetition and variation allows it to separate itself from policing, as described by Rancière, where police occupies the evacuation of politics and the institution of pure policy. So in this case, police is the imposition of the dominant culturally performed language, English. Flux is the central characteristic at play here, and I'm drawing this from what Bernard Stiegler calls the temporal object constituted by the time of its passing. He draws this from Husserl's description of flux and flow in his time theory. The object that passes and is constituted by the fact that, like the consciousness that it unites, it disappears as it illuminates possibilities. So I want to instrumentalize this ideal of radical cryptophasia and its dynamic and fluxing state as my primary metaphor. I want to lift it to examine the movement of radical cryptophasia as a fulcrum through which we may compare it with the database or Saussurean model, which operates depending on translation, or what I call taming through translation. I think in applying radical cryptophasia to new media bodies and thus grounding its political mobility, we can characterize it as, in real-world instances, with communication protocols such as probing, denial of service, user-to-root, and remote-to-local hacking attacks. I think these applications corrupt the decentralized database by directing towards and transfiguring HTML movement. These attacks on HTML movement are permutative. Every step forward enacts hypertrophy and contraction of the decentralized net protocols. And I'm drawing from Alex Galloway's research in protocol. And this ability to permutate visibly written code or spoken word is the marking of potential movement that's invisible at the very moment of its visibility or its utterance. The DDoS attack simultaneously erases and compiles code retrieved in the database string, participating in an invisible process of expanding the database elements while wiping them, calling the structure itself into question. The high-speed velocity of radical cryptophasia, as enunciated by the Kennedy twins or performed by such probes, is noteworthy to underscore, for not only does it resist translation, but it directly contradicts the delay, the retardation, the retard, which is the central tenet attributed to this necessary component of cryptophasia by researchers such as Zazo. So I want to expand on the slippage of this term retard, as it's used by the discursive bodies circumscribing the Kennedy twins, and retard as a synonym of delay. Andrea Hirst describes the symbolic order of the big other as enacting a limiting decapitation, a limitless dissolution according to the veil of alienation. So the transgression of stereotypes is always inscribed in the discourse as a logical moment on account of the slippage intrinsic to language for Hirst. She's drawing from Lacan, of course, but while the use of retarded in Poto and Cabengo is existentially a reference to something abstract and non-existent, some non-existent disability, in quotes, it's a gesture towards some symbolic order insofar as it's also engaged in containment. If we consider this use of retard as a means of containing or slowing down radical cryptophagia, then it's even more noteworthy that retard serves to comprehend and codify the radical free movement that the Kennedy twins' cryptophagia performs. So medical discourse has, of course, only recently discarded this term, so social affect has tangibly modified the discourse of disability studies, regardless of the revelation that the Kennedy twins are of normal intelligence, which is something that's offered towards the end of the film. We observe the family patriarch, Tom Kennedy, the father, repeatedly vying and nervously explicating his daughter's behavior to the camera, as if he's struggling to translate that which he can't comprehend. So regardless of these vacuous variables, retardation, as it's described to radical cryptophagia, seems like a desperate attempt to enact translation. Disability studies has vehemently responded to these acts of outsider translation. John Derby's comprehensive study, Disability Studies in Art Education, describes social networking on YouTube and other Web 2.0 avenues as having helped build a responding disability aesthetic. More importantly, this aesthetic is one that Derby characterized as developed by the disability community itself, rather than as a product of discursive practices or practices that serve to create an effect rather than an origin, a performance rather than an essence. So how can we understand the essence of the disability aesthetic if we don't examine disability as it's performed? So I think that we can look at the movement of performance. Like we have with radical cryptophagia, we can characterize the instantiations of the disability aesthetic's self-constituting essence. Amanda Baggs, whose YouTube handle is silentmiaow, is an autism spectrum disorder activist who has autism herself. She uses YouTube to perform and record her self-characterized extreme autism. Despite she does not speak in the most literal sense, she can rapidly write at a rate of 120 words a minute and uses speech and type technology to communicate with her viewers. In her video, In My Language, 2007, she enacts her severe autism by flailing her arms, chanting, rubbing objects against her face. The second part of the video is titled Translation, and Baggs uses type and speech technology to explain how her engagement with her environment is her enacting her native language, pedagogically engaging with disability and its performance and representation. In her 2007 Wired interview, she notes that her language is not rooted in visual symbols for interpretation. For her to cultivate form and to be seen, as Judith Butler terms it, she's reassuming the translation process. So being seen calls into reference Deleuze's line from What is the Creative Act? In characterizing control society, Deleuze notes that the people are missing. Perhaps I think we can offer a collective closure between the disability aesthetic of Web 2.0 and cinema in that they reinstate the people and that the reactive image must take part in the invention of a people emergent. The people are missing is a new basis on which film is founded, according to Deleuze, to contribute to the invention of a people emerging. While control society, the master and the colonizer claim in unison that there has never been a people here, the missing people invent themselves and thus create a people to come. Baggs' video uses performance to accentuate appearance and counter such mechanisms of control via a distinct approach to entrepreneurship of the self. This is what Judith Butler terms cultivating form. But I want to note that in this instance, the movement of such appearance is one that is progressive. It's one that ultimately does use translation to appeal to the emergent or culturally dominant database. I think radical cryptophagia does not seek to be seen by the emergent, despite its marginal presence, because it's expropriated of all identity. I think in this way it occupies Agamben's notion of the coming being as whatever being. In being politically mobile, radical cryptophagia depends on being veiled behind the database. It can repeat a previously used word, term, or element, or engage in progressive permutation, enacting new possibilities. For Manovich, visibility is a central tenet of the database, as perception is the primary analytic tool with which we can parse the database. This is why he turns to Vertov's Man with the Movie Camera to animate the filmic database conditions of postmodernity. His database exists perceptually, whereby elements can be added to the list and subsequently enumerated. The database exists as a system with impulses to control, paralyzing images, and framing to parse them as information and translate from a source code. For Manovich, this is a necessary analytic protocol he exercises in projects such as how to compare 1 million images. And in comparison to radical cryptophasia, after enumerating or moving forwards, the database can only move backwards. The database's movement does not determine its elements, and the database is unable to consider moving forwards and backwards simultaneously. So my conclusion is to propose that extending Saussurean theories of language as a means to codify new media objects and describe postmodernity invokes capitulating to control society. Deleuze rebuffed this by opposing the creative act, and this is why we are gathered today, to examine the reactive image, and I would like to posit radical cryptophasia as fitting this qualification. If film has meaning for philosophy, it's because it's an arena where truths are possible, and by truths I'm relaying what Alain Badiou calls truths, those rare moments where philosophy does not bolster the hegemonic status quo or democratic materialism, but opposes what Lacan called the discourse of the university. That's that which holds everything together that can be counted or categorized. So the reactive image produces that which cannot be grasped only in terms of its effects on bodies and languages, but must construct a new relationship between bodies and languages. According to Bernard Stiegler, this notion of biopower has been replaced by psychotechnical psychopower. So I think the radical cryptophagia is a metaphor for resistance, counters the database logic, and it wields the uncontrolled, agile, multivalent dynamism of vital power, and it counters control society and allows for the imagination of alternative possibilities. I applaud this Anopticon project. It's known as Big Brother Viewer. It maps CCTV cameras, but I'm pleading that we go beyond appearance or spatial discipline and address psychopower and auto-exploitation. I think in a post-industrial mechanized moment of pessimism, this is exemplified through the popularity of Eugene Thacker's philosophy of nihilism and pessimism and Donald Trump's America, the tools to imagine seem necessary. So I'm offering this term radical cryptophagia, this metaphor, as an ideal, something for us to provide ways of conceiving of being. I think one way of illuminating this in everyday life is educating and democratizing hacktivist tools such as the DDoS attacks that are not concerned with appealing to translations within some dominant socialized system, within some explicit database terminology. So, thank you.